And now, of course, to talk about the season preview, College Softball 2023, I am joined by the man in charge of X-rating softball when it comes to college softball coverage. He has become a regular on this show, and he's become a regular on this portion of the year where we break down all the mid-major conferences. I speak of one Justin McLeod, Justin, who's now got his own podcast. How dare you?
I saw what you were doing and I couldn't help but join the party.
It's from the cheap seats. That's where you're also doing this show from. It's from the cheap seats, correct?
Correct. You are correct.
Good.
I like how you did that.
Thank you. You'll get used to the liners as you do more of these episodes. There.
Yeah.
Let's get into it though. Obviously, we're gonna break down all the non-power fives here on this segment. It's gonna be lengthy, folks. We're gonna go through. We're gonna talk about all 27 conferences. They will be brought up at some point during this episode here in this segment. So we'll begin with this simple question, though, Justin. Who is this year's UCF? Who is the team that can make noise from outside the Power Five? Like James Madison going to the World Series a couple years ago. UCF hosting a regional, being a national seed, winning a regional, getting to the super regionals before running into Oklahoma. And many believe if they don't run into Oklahoma, they probably would have been in the World Series. So that's the first question for you as we begin this. Who do you think is the best team in the country that's not a Power Five school, quote unquote, so far in this year?
Well, the easy place to start is Wichita State. That's an obvious one with the offense that they bring. But even if we leave the American behind for a minute, just because Wichita and UCF are such juggernauts at this point, I'm going to go in the Sun Belt. I think the Raging Cajuns might have their best team since Jerry Glasgow's been there. Certainly not their most talented team in terms of raw talent, just because there's no transfers, there's no big Power Fives, But I really like the mix of what the Cajuns have. I like their pitching. Also in the Sun Belt, you've got Texas State, who I really think could make some noise. I think they've got a consistent roster. They've got Jessica Mullins. That's an ace that you don't get very often, and certainly not in this day and age who stays around, but she has. She's a difference maker for Texas State. And I don't want to leave out, I mean, you've got Conference USA, and I think there's two teams in Conference USA that could fit that bill. North Texas, obviously, we know the pitching staff there is pretty renowned at this point, got some positives on the offense. But let's not forget Charlotte is sitting over there in North Carolina. Last year, Charlotte was very up and down. I think we talked about him in the season preview. I think we talked about him in the season post-mortem. They had such high hopes, had really solid non-conference year, just bottomed out in conference. But they have a lot of talent on that roster, and they play a good non-conference. So that's one that I think could make some noise if they get, if they right the wrongs from last year.
Well, we'll start with those conferences. Let's start with the American. Let's start there because you mentioned Wichita State. I mean, the Scarborough likes Wichita State as well. UCF, obviously, the defending champions. They were the team that made the noise last year. Interesting year in the American. UCF graduates Gianna Mancha and Kamal Woodall from that team last year. The big question is who steps in those shoes for UCF. Wichita State loses their top two pitchers as well. They've got some other questions. And, of course, South Florida loses the queen, the Georgina Cork, who's a top 3 finalist for National Player of the Year, really defined South Florida softball, has been by far been the best pitcher in the American for the last handful of years. She graduated. This is a young league when it comes to pitching with many questions, but a league that has a lot of star power offensively. Your thoughts on the American?
I think you hit on the big question. Who's going to be the team with the pitching? Because nobody at this point in time could I sit there and tell you, hey, that team's got good pitching. All right, now I would sit there and tell you about Wichita, about UCF, about South Florida, really about anybody in the conference. Well, they have pitchers, but at the end of the day, we don't know what those pitchers are going to be made of. A lot of them is youth. Yeah, sure, there's some transfers here and there who maybe didn't play so much at their previous school. I think of like Lauren Howell at Wichita State. She was at Arkansas. She didn't pitch. So, yeah, she's obviously got talent because she was at Arkansas and also Wichita State picked her up out of the portal. But what's she going to be made of in the circle? We don't know. The youth, like you talk about, the young players. And two, I think the pitching is also of such importance because like you say, the offense, the firepower, the star power is there, whether it's UCF with Jada Cody and Shayna Doherty, who's clutching as better than anybody. Sydney McKinney, Addison Barnard over at Wichita State, even some players like Haley Morgan at Tulsa, or even Josie Foreman at South Florida, solid players are all on the offensive side. So I think pitching is going to be the name of the game in the American. I honestly think the American will come down to what team's pitching develops and delivers down the stretch. That's going to answer.
Right. I mean, the irony is, I think in your forecast at Extra Innings Softball, you had Houston's Wilkie as the pitcher of the year. She was just called conference pitcher. I believe she's the only all-conference pitcher that returns there because everybody graduated.
Exactly. Everybody graduated.
And that might be why some people might give Houston a shot. If you have Wilkie as the best pitcher, she was, of course, the transfer out of Northwestern. You know, Wichita State, you mentioned Howell to go along with Cooper, who was kind of on that weekend rotation last year. Caitlin Felton was on the UCF weekend rotation last year, somewhat just lost innings because, you know, Woodall and Mancha were so good. They have Sarah Willis, the transfer from Washington, was a top 10 former Extra Innings Softball ranked player out of high school. Explosive arm with an explosive bat, will be a two-way player for them. Could be a factor for them. And then, you know, a team like South Florida, that's the one that everybody's wondering about. Ken Erickson, I had on the show, believe that sounds like they're going to go by committee. Got a couple of freshmen they like, but it's interesting. It's going to be interesting which team's pitching staff can grow up and, you know, be good enough because the offense, the talent otherwise is tremendous. UCF basically returns just about everybody on the skill position. They lose Justine Molina and Denali Shophocker, but they added Chloe Evans. I'll give you the stat. UCF outfielders last year, not named because Jada Cody got some starts in the outfield, but not named Jada Cody, combined for 7 homers as a team. Chloe Evans had 12 last year with Minnesota. They've added Evans. They've added Sarah Willis, who has got power. One of the things I think Coach Balmelo is trying to address with UCF is get more power in their lineup, in particular in the outfield, because when you go up against the Oklahomas, like you will in a year in the Big 12, you're going to need that long ball to go mix it up with the speed that they have. So that's a key. Of course, Wichita has, off explosiveness offensively. Nobody will question them. And then South Florida's offense is going to have to do something this year. I mean, they've been, let's be real, Corrick has carried them, and we'll see how that goes.
It's no wonder Corrick had back problems. She carried that team on her back for 5 years.
Which literally happened at the end.
Yeah.
Maybe that was fitting. That's a great point because she kind of got banged up and injured at the end there and back to injury, whatever in the region. Maybe that's really what happened there. The other storyline in the American, Stephanie Van Brakel, the longtime pitching coach at Alabama, now is the Memphis head coach there. This league has been a 3-bid league, Justin. Over, under, I'm going to go 2.5 on how many teams this you think could get to the field.
Confidently under. I think they get to. I think it's Wichita and UCF all the way. I don't really, honestly, truthfully, no offense to South Florida and Houston, I don't see anybody getting super close for a third.
So that's the story in the America. The conference tournament, it will be in Tampa. You mentioned the Sun Belt. That's where the Ragin' Cajuns are there, ranked top 25. You mentioned Texas State, Jessica Mullins. They were one of the first 4 teams out. Other storylines this year in the Sun Belt, a bigger league. James Madison is now in the Sun Belt with Southern Miss and Marshall. Talk about those additions and your thought, overall impact it will have on the Sun Belt.
I think it makes the Sun Belt considerably stronger. I mean, obviously, we know what James Madison did a couple of years ago. Obviously, last year, record-wise, they weren't to that level. They weren't there. I don't honestly see that necessarily changing. I think they're still going to have some struggles on the field. I'm not saying that was a one-year wonder in terms of progress and success, but it's once you reach the pinnacle of that mountain and you lose so much. Think about that senior class that got him there last year. It definitely is a drop-off point to a certain extent. So I think that will probably continue for James Madison. I think they're going to still struggle. I mean, you think you've got a Hannah Shiflett. She's a solid talent, but you just don't have the depth. You don't have the crop of talent that you had in that World Series year. But JMU does bring a solid softball tradition. You're talking about a team that hosted super regionals even in the years before they went to the World Series. So they've had several years of sustained success. You've got Marshall, again, several years of sustained success under a couple of different coaches. Got some talent on that roster right now. Graduated some last year, kept some. Got a really good pitcher in the circle in Sydney Nestor. And you've got Southern Miss that, you know what? They went to the World Series twice. Sure, it was at the turn of the century. But a program in the Sun Belt with World Series experience is what, 1? It's the Cajuns. Well, no, 2, I guess, now with JMU. That's it. So that adds something, even though it was 20 years ago. But I think Southern Miss, if they're the third of the 3, I honestly think all 3 can be factors in the Sun Belt. And I think that adds tremendously to the conference's strength. I think it adds tremendously to the strength of the conference as a whole.
Yeah, Natalie Poole at Southern Miss, new head coach coming over there from
Yep.
Memphis. That being said, do any of these teams challenge the Cajuns?
I think Texas State's the only one with a real shot. I think that's another stark 1-2 for me. I think there are some who sure could take a game from the Cajuns type of deal, but I don't think Texas State's the only one I think might even have a chance at taking the conference title, and those two teams play at Lamson Park, which I mean doesn't necessarily bode well for Texas State.
Now the Cajuns host a conference tournament. Can this league get back to a multiple bid league? Remember they had the banner year 2 years ago, 4 bids. And a year ago this time we were hyping up the Sun Belt. They kind of had a disappointing season. And in particular, South Alabama and Troy really didn't live up to the expectations. Lackey's back for South Alabama. Troy has a new head coach. Your thoughts on those two? What do we expect from them, especially Troy with a new head coach?
I think we saw both teams backslide a little bit last year. For South Alabama, I think Olivia Lackey a little bit of that sophomore slump, so to speak. She was still very good, dealt with an injury, but just not as new on the scene as she was as a freshman. Troy obviously had a lot of things to deal with last year. I mean, your head coach goes on leave the week before the season. Your two assistants become interims. Your director of ops becomes an assistant. Like that's a lot of turmoil right at the beginning. So I don't think Troy really had a fair shot to back up that title or not the title, that NCAA tournament appearance the year prior. I think we'll see both teams have their struggles. I think in the Sun Belt preseason coaches poll, South Al was 3, Troy was 4. Um, South Al 3-4 is a good spot for them. I have Troy a little lower. They got Kelly Horn, preseason player of the year for the Sun Belt. I think she's very good, one of the best second basemen in the country. One last year for her. I think she's very solid. That's going to be a cornerstone for them. But honestly, for me, the biggest thing for Troy is can they get Leanna Johnson to pitch legally? Like that's going to be a difference maker because Troy would have had some big wins. They would have been in more games if Johnson doesn't get called for illegal pitches. Like you said, new coaching staff. We'll see if that changes.
What's your thoughts on the new staff with Newell Division coming over from Division 2?
I mean, Eric Newell's had success. He was at Auburn Montgomery. He was at a school, I believe, up in Missouri before that. He's had success everywhere he's been. I am curious if it's going to translate over to the Division 1 level right away. If it's going to be something that maybe takes a little more time. I will say this: I don't think Troy is necessarily in a rebuilding position. I think Troy's in a position where they can win now. Not necessarily they're going to win a championship now, but they can win games now. They can be in that 4-5 spot and be a solid contender at least right away. And then his coaching staff. I mean, Anna Shelnut. Everybody remembers postseason Anna from Florida State's World Series run. You've got Camden Decker as the pitching coach. It's a very young coaching staff behind Newell, and Newell's young in the sense of he's never coached Division 1 before. So I think it's a staff that's got some questions for me, but there is potential and there is an upside. It's just a matter of what happens.
Conference USA, a fascinating year in the league. It's really the last year of the league as we know it. It is going to implode. It's already imploded some by losing Marshall and Southern Miss. But boy, this thing is going to be so different next year. Good luck to your forecast. And I'm not even going to get into all the changes that's going to happen because that's a separate podcast. That's an off-season podcast. Yeah. So let's just focus on the now. And everybody is talking North Texas. There has not been a team. I've been blown away. Everybody. Amanda Scarborough pumping up loves North Texas. Anybody that's covered softball, North Texas. What a difference a year makes. Nobody barely talked North Texas last year. This year, it's all about Rodney DeLong and North Texas, bringing back the nucleus that got to a regional final last year in Stillwater. And man, people just are, this is the team. And there's usually a team that people are jumping on the bandwagon. This is the team this year. Your thoughts on this? High expectations for them in their last year in CUSA before they go to the American.
I do think North Texas is a very good team. They're a deep team. I think we saw the pitching staff deliver last year, which I think is a good portion of the crux of a lot of people's reasons for why they like North Texas this year is because when you have a pitching staff with multiple pitchers who perform so well, that's a huge deal at a mid-major. I know people don't like the term mid-major, but at a non-power 5. And the offense for North Texas, absolutely. There was plenty of development there, a lot of production. I think the biggest thing for North Texas is because they reached that regional final, first because they finally reached the pinnacle and won the Conference USA tournament, which they had not done. They'd won the regular season or shared the regular season and had not won the tournament, had not gotten to the NCAAs. They win that tournament after not winning the regular season. Then they go on to the regional final in Stillwater, beat Nebraska, Big Ten champion, to get there. and now come into this year with such expectations. I think the shoes on the other foot for North Texas, instead of being the hunter, which they a role that they thrived in and that they relished, now they are the hunted. And that brings with it a whole different approach. It brings with it dealing with different things. It brings with it the notoriety. Like you say, everybody says, hey, North Texas might be this year's JMU, this year's UCF. How North Texas deals with that one factor, I think, will dictate a lot about how their season's going to go.
Who's their biggest threat in CUSA?
To me, it's probably Charlotte. I don't want to hype Charlotte as much because last year they didn't necessarily deliver on all that hype.
What a wild roller coaster year. A team that was on fire, top 25 for the first time, beat Virginia Tech.
Yep.
There were some whispers, people trying to say, hey, maybe they could sneak into a host spot. Struggled immensely in conference play and did not make the tournament despite the fact their RPI was in the early 30s. We're not even in the first 4 out, Justin. That's how much they poorly they did. If they would have been finished at the top of conferences, they'd probably get in as an at-large. Who knows? Why will this year be different for Charlotte?
I think last year, one of the biggest things that plagued Charlotte down the stretch and in conference play was the exact same thing I just said about North Texas. They got to the point where not only was there hype, but there were results. They beat Virginia Tech. They beat Wichita State. They beat all these really good NCAA tournament, hard-hitting, solid pitching teams. So they're in the top 25. The first RPI rankings, I believe they were number 9 last year. So you're talking top 10 RPI. You don't hear of that from a Conference USA team. And all of a sudden, this team that was going to take the nation by storm and shock everybody, well, all of a sudden, now everybody's eyes are on you. You're in the top 25. People are paying attention. They're voting for you. All the eyes are on you. You are expected to deliver. And I think they honestly just wilted under those expectations to a certain extent. What's different this year is that they did wilt, and they've had an off season, and they've had a tournament selection Sunday off where they can sit there and not hear their name called. They don't have to do anything on Monday because the season's over. I think that makes a difference for the Charlotte team this year because they are talented. You've got the Bouvinois and you've got the Ella Chanceys, solid talents, really solid offensive players. And the Bouvinois of the world, twice defending Conference USA Player of the Year now. She knows what she's made of. She knows what her team's made of. But this Charlotte team's got a chip on their shoulder now. No longer are they hunting others where nobody knows their name, but also no longer are they top of the mountain. Now they are the team that disappointed. Now they are the team who could have gotten there. Oh, what could have been. And they didn't deliver. And I think that chip on their shoulder is what makes a difference for this year's Charlotte team.
The team that just missed the NCAA tournament, that was one of the first 4 teams out in CUSA, was not Charlotte, but Western Kentucky. Amy Tudor and company. I feel like we do this now. We underestimate, we don't think they'll be great. And then next thing you know, they get themselves in the mix. They made the tournament 2 years ago by winning the conference tournament. They were the first 4 out, maybe the first team out. Maybe they win an extra game or 2. They would have been in. Your thoughts on Western Kentucky? They're always hovering there, and maybe in any other teams you like in the league.
Western Kentucky is still a really solid team. I'll say that. They lost Shelby Nunn. And you think, oh, well, you lose your ace. She pitched in all the big games. She threw well against Arkansas in that midweek last year. Oh, well, they're going to go down the dumps. I don't think that's the case. Katie Gardner is still a solid arm. Katie Gardner is still effective in the circle. And you're right. Western is one of those teams that is wiry, that is scrappy, that just finds a way to win ball games. And they play some tough opponents. They play a tough schedule. So it's not like they're doing it against, no-name teams, so to speak. So I do think it's important to not underestimate Western Kentucky. They've still got talent on the roster, like I mentioned, Gardner in the circle. They've got offensive talent. A couple of transfers even that maybe on paper, okay, where did they come from? What are they going to do? How much are they going to handle? But Amy Tudor has got something going at Western. And you're right, for a Conference USA team, one of the first 4 teams out to be that close to an at-large, even though they missed out on an at-large, that's a huge difference maker. That's a huge difference maker. And I think it's important to not underestimate WKU. And I got to throw in a mention for Louisiana Tech. You ask about other teams in the conference. That's the defending regular season champions. Kind of surprised some people got back really quickly under Josh Taylor to what they were under Mark Montgomery 3 years ago. And, they graduated their ace in Audrey Pickett after last year. And so the pitching there, like we've talked about so much in so many different teams already, is a question mark. Who's going to be the ace? Who's even going to just take the most innings? So I think if they can answer the pitching question, there are some offensive pieces in Sierra Sacco and Amanda Gonzalez, Brooke Diaz, really, really good offense there in Ruston. If they can figure out the pitching question, I think they'll be in really good shape to challenge for a title again this year. I think there's some real potential there.
Got another storyline there. New era in FAU in Boca Raton, Florida. Jordan Clark, the new head coach at Florida Atlantic, came over from Ohio State assistant. Courtney Dyfo, who we had on the show, called her, quote, a rock star, someone to keep an eye on. I know you like that hire. As far as among the mid-major hires, you have that high ranked pretty high there, Jordan Clark to FAU.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, last year, if you look at Ohio State, they had missed the NCAA tournament for a couple years. Okay, why? What's going on? And there was two reasons. It was Lexi Hanley in the circle, and it was the offense. The offense had a real resurgence last year, and Clark was the hitting coach. So you come off a year like that at Ohio State, you take over at FAU. It's not easy to take over for somebody like Joe Joyce for what she meant to the game through decades in the game as a player, and then even just leading the FAU program from its inception. The one thing I think about Jordan Clark getting to Boca Raton is, even from the outside looking in, even just from hearing stuff on the recruiting trail during the summer, hearing stuff in the fall, just kind of observing, you can tell there is an injection of new life into that FAU program. If you think about it, last year, what FAU did in making the conference tournament after Joan Joyce passed away was impressive. It's not easy to do. And now when you see what this FAU team is made of this year, the energy they bring, just in snippets of what you see and what you hear, if those kinds of things play out on the field, that's an FAU team that does have talent on it. You brought a couple of transfers. I think of Becca Jones coming from Purdue, who was solid at Purdue, but you bring her to an FAU, she could be really good in Conference USA. You've got Sarah Berthume, Lynn Gardner in the circle. There's some talent down there in Boca Raton. And with that injection of just that energy and that enthusiasm and just that new look at everything down in Boca, like, I think that's a team that has some potential this year. I'm not saying they're going to sit here and challenge for a championship, but I think certainly they could be a factor in Conference USA.
We move to the Mountain West. Mountain West this year will have a conference tournament held at San Diego State. Speaking of a new coach, Nicole Dixon, the new head coach at New Mexico, San Diego State, the defending champions. But begin life without Maggie Ballot, Del. Big question there. Who takes her spot? UNLV, Christy Fox and company. Life without Jenny Bresler, who's obviously moved on to Virginia. Boise State, Justin Schultz, year 2, had a great year 1. Won over 40 games, but didn't get a whiff of the NCAAs. They added another Walt Jasper. They multiplied it, adding Walt Jasper, the youngster, the pitcher from Charlotte. Your thoughts on a Mountain West, which is a pretty divided opinion as far as this league, who should be the favorites, and they even showed in the preseason poll very kind of balanced voting between Boise State and San Diego State, and then you still got UNLV in that mix. Your thoughts on the Mountain West?
I mean, I can actually agree with the coaches in the sense of it being such a tight race. I mean, I think it was 1 point separated Boise State and San Diego State in the preseason coaches poll. One of them got 5 first place votes, the other one got 4. So you're probably talking about the matter of 1 first over second place vote was the difference there. It is a tight race. I'll say this. I do expect San Diego State to backslide somewhat this year. You had some offense last year who it was really solid. I think of Mac Barber, who had such a year at the plate. But you lose Maggie Ballot in the circle, and now San Diego State's not going to take anybody by surprise. I think they've got 2 pitchers, Didi Hernandez, I know to be one of them, and then even Sarah Lehman coming over from DePaul or Iowa, DePaul, third school she's on as a transfer now. And so you have a pitching staff there, and I know I'm missing somebody else, but you've got 3 arms, yes, that can be effective. None of them can be Ballot. No, there is no Maggie Ballot potential on that staff. They can be effective. They can eat innings. They may be, solid arms, but there's just not a Ballot. And Ballot had that X factor. Ballot was that, okay, you know what? She can eat innings. She's good. She's got a sub-1 ERA, whatever else. But Ballot had something else. She had that X factor. I don't think anybody on that staff has that X factor at this point. So I expect San Diego State to backslide a little bit, and I expect Boise State and UNLV to be the biggest beneficiaries. I think Boise State does have a talented team returning. On both sides. I think the fact that Lindsey Wall-Jasper, like you mentioned, comes in, a little bit of an infusion. They graduated 2 pitchers who got a lot of work last year. Well, now you still got Taylor Caldwell there, and then you bring in Lindsey Walljasper. That's another good 1-2 combo. Offense is back. Both Flores sisters are back. Aaliyah Flores came back, the former Oklahoma transfer. She's back for her super senior year. You've got Kelsey Hall, who came back last year, batted like 380, I believe it was, after tearing her ACL the year prior. So you've got a really solid offense there. And then UNLV, yes, they lose Bresler. So, okay, what's the pitching going to look like? But they've got a solid offense coming back. So to me, I think it is a three-way race at the top of the Mountain West. I could see New Mexico making some moves, not necessarily moves close to that top tier, but moves beyond where they were last year. There's some other teams, I see this, see that, but I think it's a three-team race for the top. I picked Boise State in the preseason forecast. I think they're the most complete team. They're the team I trust the most. But I also could see if UNLV can have some pitching emerge, or if San Diego State can have, maybe one of those pitchers develops the balanced style X factor. Maybe the offense can manage to, continue what they were doing last year. I think it's going to take more than what they did last year because they had that surprise factor to a certain extent. But those could certainly be game changers for those two programs. But I think it's a three-way race for first place to me.
Similar to the American in that I think it's time who steps up in the circle pitching wise could decide that race a little bit. Do you think the conference tournament will help or hurt the Mountain West in their quest to be a multi-bid league?
In that specificity, I think it probably hurts them more than it helps them, because the thing about a conference tournament, you're never going to benefit from a conference tournament unless you've got 4 or 5 teams that are high RPI. So if you had the upper tier, the majority of the conference, at least 5 teams who were, top 60 RPI, top 75 even RPI, well, then you know what? A UNLV could go in there, finish third in the conference, like last year. Okay, say UNLV's third in the conference, they go in there, and they beat a couple of teams, and it's them and Boise who won the regular season in the championship game of the Mountain West tournament. Well, what you have then is Boise, who has a regular season, wins that come along with it, but you have UNLV who just added 2 or 3 more, top tier wins or mid tier wins. That's a difference maker. Well, the way the Mountain West is set up right now, because it's a 3-team race, you don't have that. What you do have is the opportunity for teams that are high RPI, like a San Diego State, a Boise, UNLV, to lose to a San Jose State, to a Utah State, who are lower in RPI. Well, that obviously doesn't help anybody in terms of the Mountain West trying to be a multi-bid league. And then also you have the potential of, okay, what if San Diego State wins the conference, but San Jose State wins the conference tournament? Then San Diego State has to rely on their non-conference schedule being strong enough to get an at-large bid. And I just don't think you're going to see that in the Mountain West. They're strengthening, but they're not to their strongest yet. So right now, I think the conference tournament hurts them in that specifically.
I think it depends too how they do non-conference. A lot of variables there could decide that, but you're right. You kind of the thing that worries you is those bottom teams when you play them an extra time or two kind of hurts your schedule strength there a little bit. We'll see how that goes. A league that has been a multi-bid league, no league has had a bigger facelift this year than the Missouri Valley.
Yeah.
A league that has added Murray State, has added Illinois of Chicago, has added give me you've got the list. It's a lengthy list. Describe the changes in the Valley, because it is, for this year, it's no league has had a greater shift than the Valley.
Yeah, and on the softball side especially, because you add Murray State, which is coming off an Ohio Valley Conference championship and a regional 3 seed in the NCAA tournament. You get Illinois Chicago, that was a Horizon League tournament champion perennially. And then you've got Belmont, who made the same climb as Murray State did last year, finished 1 spot behind Murray State in the OVC, and played in the tournament championship game. So you add those 3 programs, you take out Loyola Chicago, goes to the A10. They were, mid-low pack. So, but you still take out one team. You add those 3, you have vaulted from a good league to an absolute stud of a softball league. Murray State, Belmont, and Illinois Chicago all returned some talent. Murray State obviously returns their 2-headed pitching monster, and I do mean it is a monster of a staff. So Missouri Valley went from a team, like you say, a couple of years ago, multi-bid NCAA tournament. Now they're right back in that hunt this year, and they've got a viable chance at challenging for those multiple bids. And, in a conference like the Valley, to get that much stronger, overnight from June 30th to July 1st, it's virtually unheard of.
It's wild. And then you got the incumbents like Northern Iowa, Missouri State. What's your thoughts on the incumbents versus the new members. That's going to be the storyline in that league. Will it help it be a multi-bid league this year, or is it going to cannibalize itself and not be a multi-bid league this year?
I do think there will be some cannibalizing itself in terms of the Valley. I do think some of the top teams are going to beat one another. I don't think you're going to see a lot of series sweeps up on that top tier, but I think they could challenge for a multi-bid league. There's some injury concerns over at Northern Iowa that I think could impact them. But for instance, if a Murray State happens to not win the Missouri Valley tournament, well, you know what? That is a difference maker, because if Murray State plays a good non-conference, they have the history of being in the NCAA tournament. People know Hannah James. They're going to know Jetta Bieber. Something like that, I could absolutely see it. But there's enough teams, I think, in the Missouri Valley that are going to play tough schedules that are probably going to pull off some wins against top-tier opponents. I mean, think about it. Missouri State had a win in the NCAA tournament last year as the Missouri Valley champs. That's a difference maker. So I think they could challenge to be a multi-bid league, but to your point, I do think there will be some cannibalizing of itself. I don't think you're going to see a lot of series sweeps in the upper tier, and that mid tier is just good enough that I think you could see them pull some games from the top dogs, and who knows what happens at that point.
And then new head coach at Illinois State from within, promotion similar to Michigan, a legendary coach retiring, assistant promoted.
Yeah, exactly. Tina Kramos takes over from Melinda Fisher. I mean, yeah, it's a change of scenery, but it's not going to be like a total overhaul in terms of coaching style. Kramos has been there. They were there for Illinois State's, most recent successes. She's been there a long time. I don't think you'll see a lot of change over there. I think you'll see a lot of consistency, going from Fisher to Kramos. She'll put her own stamp on it, to be sure. But you're right. That is something worth noting, because, Melinda Fisher, Valley softball without Melinda Fisher seems like it's almost unheard of.
Without Fisher and without Carrie Blaylock, who officially it was officially retired, and now Jen Sewell, again, longtime assistant, promoted. Your thoughts on Sewell at Southern Illinois?
I like that one too, actually. I think Sewell, again, had been with Blaylock for a long time on staff. Was somebody who played into, again, their greatest successes in most recent years. And Sewell got some hands-on head coaching experience last year when Blaylock, took a leave of absence before ultimately retiring. I think that one is probably going to be a little more of a seamless transition simply because of that. But also at the same time, I really like Sewell's staff. She already had Kenzie Tate Bennett there as the pitching coach, had been the full-time, went to a volunteer, came back to full-time this year. But she's also got Mary Jo Fernbach, has familiarity with SIU. She's coached it. She most recently was at North Carolina, and got a really solid coaching history. So I really like that staff as a whole. So I do think the transition to SIU might be a little more seamless, just because they had that practical experience last year, but also the staff as a whole, although they be new as a unit, I think the staff as a whole is experienced.
We move over to the ASUN, where Liberty has been the dominant program in the ASUN Conference. The big question there, this will be their last year at the ASUN before going to Conference USA. The question is, who can challenge Liberty in the ASUN?
For me, the top team in that, to answer that, is Central Arkansas. I actually really like Central Arkansas this year. There was no hangover, so to speak, coming from the Southland to the ASUN. Central Arkansas sat there and won, I believe, was close to 40 games last year. They've still got their two-hitter pitching monster of Caleb Bieber and Jordan Johnson. Honestly, they have offense. Mary Kate Brown, Jenna Wildeman is wily and speedy on the base paths. And also, Central Arkansas knows how to win the big games. They took a game from LSU last year. They started this home-and-home series in state with the Arkansas Razorbacks 2 years ago, and every game they have played has been really tight. So when you're playing teams like LSU and you're beating LSU and you're playing Arkansas tight consistently, that shows you the progress that Central Arkansas has made. They don't have really any off weekends this year. Like they are playing tough opponents every weekend this season. So it's a very good non-conference schedule, very tough non-conference schedule. If they can withstand, losing some games, and if they can pull off some big wins, I think Central Arkansas could be in really good position, have a really good solid year, and I think they could pose a potential challenge to Liberty.
Trip McKay, Kennesaw State, do they bounce back and get in the mix as well from a couple of years ago? Remember, they made the tournament 2 years ago as a second team in the ASUN. North Florida, who got to the ASUN final last year, Jeff Conrad promoted from the assistant coach to head coach, taking over from Marcy Higgs. Shelly Robinson, her second year as head coach at Stetson. They will be hosting the ASUN tournament there. And then Queens added to the program, going from D2 to D1, Justin. They're going to have, that's a rough adjustment for them. And that could hurt the league from being a two-bid league because Queens, we anticipate will kind of, you're going to take your lumps when you're going from D2 to D1, and that might affect the opponents, teams like that end up playing Queens on their schedule.
Absolutely. I mean, even think of Bellarmine, who came over from D2 a couple of years ago. I mean, the bottom tier of the ASUN, and it's not an insult to Bellarmine or an insult to Queens, but the bottom tier of the ASUN is so, I don't want to say so bad, but they're still transitioning, to be honest. They're still D2 programs. They've not made their move. They're in D1. They're competing at D1. They're playing a D1 schedule. The wins they have are D1 wins, but they're not fully there yet. You still have to catch up in terms of financials and scholarships and, even facilities and just catch up on that D1 level. And it's not an insult to those programs. It just takes time. So I do think that's something that could potentially hurt the ASUN. You think of a Liberty or, like I say, a Central Arkansas that play such a deep non-conference schedule, and they play these teams that are not just the Central Arkansas plays Oklahoma State, Liberty's in Puerto Vallarta, they're in California, they play Oklahoma, things like that. So the top tier is so solid, they do everything they need to do to be a multi-bid league, and then you get to that bottom tier and it's just not there. You're talking about what'll be a pretty low RPI for some of those teams at the bottom. And so I do think that hurts the league as a whole. As much as Liberty and Central Arkansas and Kennesaw do to help, that bottom tier is going to drag them down a little bit. And I don't know that the top tier could do anything about it.
What do you expect from Dot Richardson's team this year?
I mean, I think they're going to be as consistent as ever. I mean, when you graduate your ace and the projections are still pretty unanimous that you're going to be the best, that tells you something. I think we'll see Liberty as a factor all season long. They're going to play OU, they're going to play Duke, they're going to play Washington week one. That's a solid week one. I think, right. Man. But I mean, if you think about it, go back a couple of years ago, Dot Richardson's team started the year 0-6, 0-7.
Right, I saw them last year. Right, they were winless in Florida last year. I saw them against UCF, but yeah, she knows. She feels it'll pay off later in the year, which it did last year.
And it did. That's the thing. She's got the history. It doesn't matter what happens results wise in those first few weeks because she knows what's going to happen. The talent, and it works. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's only crazy if it doesn't work, and it works.
Big East, fascinating league. Villanova begins life without Paige Rao. Connecticut won the regular season, but they lose their star pitcher. Skolsky goes over to Oregon. You got DePaul, Tracy Adams, perhaps a surprise preseason favorite, but they return a good nucleus there. And, of course, the big story of the offseason there, Krista Wood comes to the league as the new head coach at Creighton. Your thoughts on the Big East?
I mean, sorry, Big East coaches, but I frankly don't understand how DePaul gets voted number one. I mean, I think you have to give Villanova the benefit of the doubt at this point just because, they're the team that's come through. Last year, Villanova doesn't win the regular season. Well, they come through and they win the conference tournament. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking DePaul here. I mean, again, similar to what I said about a couple of conferences earlier, I think you have a decided, clear upper tier in the Big East. DePaul, UConn, Villanova. But this year, all three lost so much. You think about UConn, they lost at least Skolsky to transfer. She goes to Oregon. And sure, losing a pitcher to the Pac-12 is okay, UConn did something right in getting her talent-wise, but now they don't have her. UConn also graduated some of their best players after last year, so they're kind of in I don't want to call it a rebuilding year because I think UConn is still building up to the top, even with a regular season championship last year. I do think UConn's in a little bit of that rebuilding mode, though, because you don't expect to get there and then all of a sudden have to go back to the drawing board in some ways. And that's where UConn is now. To me, Villanova without Paige Rao, what does it look like? What does life look like without her? But at the same time, Villanova's fortunes didn't completely depend on Rao last year. They knew she was leaving. They knew, she was in her grandma year, if you will. So I think Villanova knew, hey, let's in some situations, let's see what we've got behind her. Let's see what we have without her, what we look like without her. And they didn't look terrible. Sure, growth needs to happen, absolutely. Sure, this and that, absolutely. Are there challenges to that? Sure. But at the same time, Villanova, since Bridget Orchard got there, has established themselves firmly as the standard in the Big East. That's the team, like I say, last year, they don't win the regular season, but guess what? They win the conference tournament. They appear in the NCAAs. It's just that's the Bridget Orchard way of life, if we're going to be honest. She did it at Fordham. She's doing it at Villanova. And I don't think that depends on Paige Rao. Sure, she's a huge part of it, major piece in that, but I don't think it totally depends on Paige Rao. And then DePaul, DePaul's got good pieces. I think the pitching for DePaul is the one place that I want to see what they're made of. You lose Sarah Lehman to a transfer, but Tracy Addick-Zins is a pitching coach and an experienced and good one. So I think DePaul factors in there too, even though I dogged on it for being picked preseason number one. And you mentioned Creighton with Krista Wood. I think it's a difference maker for Creighton. I don't think Creighton's necessarily going to be all of a sudden a conference factor, but it definitely makes a difference there. Krista Wood knows how to build a program that wins and wins consistently. So I think it's a home run for Creighton.
How long can she get him to being a contender? Of course, she's an Omaha native, played at Omaha. How long do you think before they're in the mix there, kind of like to compete for the Big East title?
I'll give her a year or two. I don't think it's going to take her super long. Because at South Dakota, it took her a while to cross over that North Dakota State hump. But South Dakota State, it took her a while to cross over that North Dakota State hump.
Sure.
But in the Big East, you got that upper tier, and I think it's easier to join an upper tier and win from that than it is to get over one team who's consistently at the top.
Shout out to Bridget Orchard, by the way, getting a new stadium look there with Villanova. Yep. It's going to be huge for that program. Coach, if you're listening, I'll invite you to come down next fall. Villanova is playing UCF in football. We could try to go to the football game. In return, you get me tickets when you get that new stadium. I think that's a fair trade.
I like that.
Like that. Bright future ahead for Coach Orchard, who's done a great job at our alma mater at Villanova and in the Big East. Kind of a murky future. The West Coast Conference. Yeah. Final year for BYU in the West Coast Conference before they bolt for the Big 12. They are the chaser this year. They did not win. They did win a share of the conference title. Gordon Eakin quickly reminded me of that when I had him on the show, but they didn't get the automatic bid because Loyola Marymount beat them head-to-head, 2 out of 3, and Coach Flowers got them to the NCAAs for Loyola Marymount. Let's first start with this before we get into the teams. What is the future of the West Coast Conference without BYU?
Good question, especially if they lose Gonzaga in basketball. Even Gonzaga doesn't play softball.
For those that may not be aware, there are rumors out there. Gonzaga has been in talks with other leagues because of their basketball program. For example, the Big 12. There's been reports that they have talked to. They talked to them right around the time that Gonzaga played at Texas. They've talked to the Mountain West. They've even talked to the Big East, speaking of which would really be bizarre. But who knows what's going to happen? But that is the other shoe to drop that has been discussed that could have a drastic impact on the West Coast Conference future, to your point.
Yeah, and that's the thing, we think about it in softball terms, but that's one place where even the non-softball team could have a huge impact, because then you lose your 2 biggest draws if you're the West Coast Conference in a matter of how many years, depending on when Gonzaga leaves, if they were to leave. In terms of the softball, you think about it, that's one of the smallest softball leagues already. You're talking about 6 teams before BYU leaves. And, yes, Loyola Marymount, first they had Sammy Ward and then now Tariah Flowers. They did that building process of getting to the point, like last year, of having that tiebreaker, of getting the automatic bid. They built to that point. They steadily got there. And now BYU's leaving, and that's going to leave Loyola Marymount at the top by themselves. Yes, a team has to finish in 3rd place, but if you look at the rest of the West Coast Conference, it's those 2 and then a solid half mile between the others. It's just it's a weak conference all around. The bottom parts do tend to cannibalize themselves. Loyola Marymount dropped 1 game to other competition. BYU only lost to Loyola Marymount last year, and thus the tie you talk about. But that's a good question. What's going to happen to the West Coast Conference? Because 5 teams, it's below the minimum to get an automatic bid. You can get a waiver, but what that looks like long term, you can't get a waiver just every year.
A waiver is something like a borrowed time. You got to think for them to survive, they're going to have to expand. And the question becomes, where do they expand to? Is it somebody in the Division 1? Is it somebody like in the Big Sky or in the WAC? Or do they go the Division 2 route? That's a story to follow in 2023 and further. I know in talking to the people in the league, they were kind of still in conversations, but it's an uneasy situation there in the West Coast Conference. There's another conference on the East Coast that you're going to get into that's in a similar boat to some extent to the West Coast Conference as far as their future. But in the immediate future, does BYU go out on top league, or does Loyola catch them, or do we have a surprise team like a Santa Clara with Gina Carbonado, who took a game from Loyola Marymount at the end of the year and nearly knocked off BYU a couple of times during the year? What's your overall thoughts on the West Coast Conference on the field this year?
To me, it's a two-team race. I mean, yeah, I could see a Santa Clara, maybe a San Diego, in some tight games like you mentioned, maybe a win over one of those top two teams, maybe. But to me, it's a two-team race. I mean, you think about Jenna Perez in the circle for LMU. I think Violet Zavodnik, get her name right eventually, at BYU is one of the premier outfielders in the country. And I also think Chloe Temples at BYU will do a capable job of stepping into the circle and being the ace for the Cougars. I think Temples being that ace is imperative to BYU's success, including in the non-conference portion of the year. And I do think she can do that. So I think it's a two-team race. I did pick BYU, and I also like the non-conference schedule for BYU. And I think this is the first time in a long time BYU's been able to go in with a chip on their shoulder. That's not a common thing for a Gordon Eakin team, just because they're so used to playing in the NCAA's every year. What are you going to get a chip on your shoulder about? They have one this year, and I think that's potentially dangerous for some opponents.
But they got to replace a great pitcher.
They do. I mean, Autumn Moffett-Korth is not easy to replace, but I think Temples has it in her to at least do a capable job of it. I think she's got it in her to at least replace her. She won't fill her shoes completely, but I think she can be effective and lead that staff.
The name to watch there, by the way, Maddie Bejarano, transfer from UCF, arguably with maybe the biggest hit in the history of UCF softball, going back to that regional against Michigan, 2 strikes, bottom of the 7th, gets the tying base hit to send the game to extra innings. She wins the game on a walk-off hit to win that Wiener's bracket game against Michigan. UCF would go on to win the regional. It's a clutch kid. Has a great story, long story there with her brother and his health down deal. So she's now closer to home. If she gets consistent at-bats there with the altitude there, don't be surprised if she kind of puts up some nice numbers there at BYU and adds to that offense, led by Zavachnik, who might be one of the most underrated hitters in the country there at BYU. The MAAC. Let's go to the MAAC, because you talk about a facelift. The MAAC, Mr. Justin McLeod, kept you busy this offseason due to a lot of coaching transactions in the carousel. Explain some of a lot of the new faces in the MAAC.
Well, we have almost seen total turnover on head coaches in the MAAC over the last 3-4 years. It's insane. We talked about 5 new head coaches in the MAAC this year. I think the biggest, most notable one was probably Craig Nicholson returning to the MAAC, taking over at Akron. Obviously, he was at Ball State for a while, went to Arizona State, then Texas A&M Kingsville at Division II. Now he's back at Akron. You're talking about changes of leadership at Western Michigan. Jenny Roan coming back to her alma mater to take over there. Toledo, Jessica Bracamonte taking over there, coming off the Duke staff. Then you also had Bowling Green, where Candace Fenton took over. She was an assistant last year, played at Bowling Green. Sarah Willis left to take a job at Bradley. They bumped they bumped Candace Fenton up, so she takes over at that spot. And then at Ohio, you've got Jenna Hall, place where she was an assistant coach not too many years ago. She was the assistant coach, hitting coach at Ohio State and Pitt. Since then, comes over for her first head coaching job. And I think it's a crop of head coaches who have some potential. Bracamonte has been around longer than people realize as an assistant coach, almost a decade already between Central Michigan and Duke. She's familiar with the MAAC. Jenny Roan played in the MAAC at Western Michigan. She's back in the MAAC. Jenna Hall coached at Ohio. She's back in the MAAC. Craig Nicholson obviously had tremendous success at Ball State. He's back in the MAAC. So the familiarity with the conference is super important, I think, to the carousel being so deep. But also, I don't think the conference is going to really suffer for it, because there's that familiarity, because there's nobody coming in with a true, okay, what am I doing? What's the MAAC made of? Everybody's kind of coming in knowing what the MAAC's made of. I think it makes it for a very interesting conference race this year.
Which of those new faces makes the biggest impact?
I think Craig Nicholson is the easy one. Akron last year, had a coaching change early in the season, a matter of a few weeks into the season, had interim head coaches the rest of the way. and performed like they overperformed expectations. They were a bottom feeder seller of the conference. Seller CELLAR. I guess my southern accent needs to clarify that. But they weren't very good. And then you know what? They were a factor in the conference. They were a factor in the conference down the stretch. So bringing Craig Nicholson into that, he's not walking into a total rebuild. He's walking into a team that overperformed last year, and he's a good coach, and he wins everywhere he's been. So I think Nicholson going back to the MAAC and going to Akron is the biggest move and biggest impactful one.
Of course, the defending champions, Miami of Ohio, Karen Kumar and company. You traveled up there to see their program up close last season. Still the team to beat, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as long as Carly Spade is there, that Miami is going to be the team to beat. Yeah, sure, I have questions about the pitching, but that offense is that offense, and that offense is not going anywhere. So I think, no matter what, I think Miami is the team to beat until somebody beats them.
A league that certainly you've got some questions about in their future. We talked about the West Coast Conference is the Big South. Talk about what's been going on in the Big South.
Well, you're talking about a team that's had some of its membership decimated, and now they're going to lose Campbell. Campbell will play in the Big South this year. They'll move after the year. But you're down to 8 softball teams in the Big South. You lose Campbell, that's 7. And, the Big South was just getting to a point where the top half of the league is pretty solid. You have Campbell, you have Longwood, you have USC Upstate. You even have Presbyterian making a run with some real talent in the circle, especially. And now Campbell's going to go. The conference is taking, some hits in terms of depth, in terms of number of teams. So I'm really curious what's going to happen to the Big South. You had some graduations after last year. Longwood, I wonder if they're going to be able to hang in that upper tier. I think we'll see a run for Presbyterian. Remember Jenna Green and Morgan Hess names. Those are 2 names I think are going to make a difference down there for the Blue Hose. But top tier of the Big South is in an interesting place right now. Upstate also graduated their 1-year grad transfer pitcher. Campbell lost a lot of talent, also lost their coach. Changed coaches. So
Sharonda McDonald, right? McDonald going to Michigan State. Trina Prater taking over, coming over as was the Iowa assistant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Trina Prater's been a head coach, and she was pretty successful in her first few places as a head coach. But still, you lose that much. You lose a coach who did what Sharonda McDonald did. You lose the talent. I still have to have questions. So the Big South was actually really trending upward last year, and I think they've kind of almost plateaued a little bit potentially. And I'm curious to see what we get out of that league, both this year and then also after Campbell leaves and what they look like after that.
What do you think they'll do moving forward as a league?
If they're going to stick in their current situation and their current membership and all that, I'm unsure. I think if they expand their members, I think they're probably looking at moving up a D2 school or 2. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of move around from other conferences. They've got a couple of non-softball playing members, so their overall membership is a couple of schools deeper than softball side is. But I think the best thing that can happen to them is that they can pull in a couple of regional D2s that just want to move up. Maybe it doesn't add as much to their costs. I think that's the best shot for the conference.
Another league with interesting questions is the Colonial. Life after James Madison officially for the league. The good news for the league is JMU, because they were down last year, had some new blood. UNC Wilmington won the conference tournament. Delaware, team that was in the mix there with a regular season title, got the old reliable Hofstra there with Adrian Clark there. Your thoughts on the Colonial this year and beyond?
I actually like the Colonial this year. I think UNC Wilmington obviously has some good offense and really good pitching, young pitching, but pitching that came through last year, that developed, that showed out, and got Wilmington to where they were by the end of the year. I think that's a big deal. I do like Delaware, actually. Delaware's got to contend. They won the regular season. They finally got over that hump, so to speak, but they couldn't get the tournament win. They couldn't get to the NCAAs. Lost a couple of pieces this summer that they didn't necessarily expect to be without when this 2023 season came around. So replacing those is going to be interesting. We got Kiara Mills, the transfer from Creighton, who should add a bat that'll be helpful. Hannah Garber's back. Emily Winburn is back in the circle. Brittany Mendoza is also back on the offense with Garber. So there's still some talent at Delaware. And then you think about it, you add a Stony Brook in there. Alyssa Costello and Corinne Badger, who had a breakout campaign last year. Both of them obviously leading that offense at Stony Brook, a newcomer to the CAA. I actually like the Colonial. I think there's some real potential for that league. It's going to be a one-bid league. We're not going to talk about a bunch of, it's going to be a top tier of 5-6 teams, but I think there are some teams in the Colonial. You mentioned Hofstra as well. They've got a lot of veteran talent. I think there are several teams in the CAA that if you told me, we do this next year, and you say, hey, Delaware was the team in the tournament last year, or Wilmington was the team in the tournament last year, or even Stony Brook was the team in the tournament last year. There's several that I don't think I'd be surprised if you told me they had succeeded this year.
And then lastly, let's go with the Atlantic 10 before we go to our lightning round. The Atlantic 10, Fordham, the defending champions there. You had GW that won the regular season title. Is it once again going to come down to those two teams?
I think so. I mean, we can't count out St. Joseph's, but I do think Fordham and GW. Fordham, I think, was the coach's pick and the coach's preseason coach's poll. But George Washington, yes, they lost Sierra Lane, but they bring back Alexa Williams. So that's the reigning player of the year. So to me, I think it's going to come down to those two at the end of the day.
Yeah, that should be a fun race. All right, let's go through the lightning round here. We're going to go through the rest of the conferences, quick thoughts, what to look for in each of these remaining leagues that we're talking about. So we're going through every mid-conference league there. Let's talk WAC, Justin. Let's start with the WAC. Big, large league, comings and goings in the leagues. Give us your what to look for in the WAC.
I think Grand Canyon's the team to beat still. They return Caitlin Dunkel. They return Ariel Thompson. I think they've got the best returning talent. I think they've got the deepest roster, and they also have last year's postseason experience. So I think Grand Canyon's the team to beat. And I would say keep an eye on Seattle. Seattle was in the tournament a couple of years ago. They're a team, familiar with postseason. So I think Seattle would be my extra team to watch, but Grand Canyon to me is the team to beat until somebody beats them.
Yeah, that's going to be Trini. The Summitt League, South Dakota State, the defending champions. Of course, Krista Wood moved on. They lose their best bat to Arkansas, but still have their two great arms from a team that made it to the regionals. Obviously, last year in Orlando was a win away from a regional final.
Yeah, and I think South Dakota State's still the team to beat the Summitt League. You lost Kylie Howerson, like you mentioned, to transfer to Arkansas, but you return Rosalind Carrillo, the shortstop, who was the player of the year in the Summitt League last year. You have Tori Kanish, you have Grace Glanzer 1-2 in the circle. Incredible pitching staff. And you add Shannon Lacey, who was really solid at Arkansas Tech, and then followed Christina McSweeney from Arkansas Tech. She's the new head coach at SDSU. So I think you've got a three-headed monster potentially in the pitching staff this year. Very deep bullpen. Love that bullpen. And the offense is still solid. They changed their offensive philosophy some this year, but I think we'll still see some really good production. Again, I think South Dakota State is the team to beat up there, even without Krista Wood, even without Kylie Halverson.
How do you think McSweeney will do at South Dakota State?
I think she'll do all right. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the biggest name hire, wasn't the one that got everybody's attention, but I think she'll do okay. The biggest thing there is if you can provide that consistency to keep doing what they're doing and not upset the apple cart. And I think because she wasn't a big name hire, I think that's the best. That's something that can happen. And I should also mention Omaha. I think that's the biggest challenge to SDSU in the Summitt League. I liked what I saw from them last year. And Cameron Meyer is a really solid arm for Omaha. So, that's, again, not a big name, not necessarily somebody people are going to go, oh, Omaha, I know about them. I think it's one to watch, though, in the Summitt League, Omaha.
North Dakota State, where are they right now?
I mean, still in the hunt, never out of the hunt as long as Darren Mueller's the head coach. I mean, the man knows how to win, and he wins pretty well. But, and again, I don't want to say that the conference has passed them by any means. But, South Dakota State's gotten that consistency right now, and they're on this run. Maybe the run gets upset with the coaching change and with some talent change, or I don't know. North Dakota State's always going to be there. But I think, honestly, we've gotten to the point with North Dakota State, anything other than winning the conference is almost a disappointment. So I think it's important to keep their success and whatever else in perspective. They're still in the hunt. I'm not going to pick them to win and all that, but they're still in the hunt. I'm never picking against a Darren Mueller team, I guess you'd say.
Southland Conference, McNeese, the dominant team, made a regional final last year in Evanston for the first time. Your thoughts on Coach Landrino and McNeese and the Southland?
I do like McNeese. Two pitchers. Again, that's been a common theme for some of these teams we've talked about, these mid-majors. That's important. Two pitchers down there at McNeese. And again, they've just established such a dynasty in the Southland, even through conference realignment. They've stayed at the top. I think they're still the team to beat. Again, until somebody beats them, and I don't know who in that Southland's going to beat them. I mean, it could be Southeastern Louisiana with their speed that they're famous for. But I really don't see anybody coming super close to challenging McNeese in that conference.
The SoCon Conference has been Chattanooga won the tournament last year. You got UNC Greensboro's been a really good pro Coach Brenneman and company there. Your thoughts on the SoCon with those two teams? I know you think this could be a fun little conference.
Yeah, I actually do. I like Samford. I like UNC Greensboro. I like Chattanooga. Western Carolina's got some talent still there. I think it's a pretty solid league, especially for a 17 league. To have four teams at the top that I think could be pretty solid, or at least have some teams at the top and then some other teams with solid talent. But what's funny is Samford really they had a coaching change. Somebody who was already in town, so to speak. Kimball Cassidy was at Birmingham Southern at D3, comes over to Samford, brings her assistant with her, and Samford was good last year. They were solid. UNC Greensboro obviously hit the ball a mile, had a really solid pitcher who transferred out after the year, and Chattanooga made a run at the end. I think Greensboro and Samford are probably the two top teams for me this year. There's good pitching at Chattanooga as well. Honestly, I think Samford is a team to watch in that conference. I think Samford has a chance at being something.
You got the Patriot League. Boston had dominated the league, was having a great year with Ashley Waters last year, top 50 RPI most of the year, but they were stunned in the conference tournament by Lehigh, who beats them twice. But Lehigh loses one of their ace pitchers who transfers over to South Florida. Your thoughts on the Patriot League? Does Boston bounce back? Can Lehigh threaten them? What's your thoughts on the Patriot League?
I do think Boston will bounce back, and I think they'll win the conference. I mean, think about Kayla Ronson was really solid at the plate last year. Allison Boaz has been solid in the circle since when she was there, or since she's been there. I think the thing for me with Lehigh, they did lose Gabby Norrie to transfer, goes back home to Florida, goes to South Florida, finish out her career as a grad transfer. And Lehigh was good in the regular season. Think about they beat Boston in the regular season even last year. And so it's not a slight to Lehigh, but I think the Patriot League is more competitive now than it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago when Boston was just running roughshod over the whole conference. But I think this year, I think Boston should be rightfully the favorites again.
We mentioned earlier about all the big moves in the Missouri Valley. Of course, the loser, I guess, or the one that got hurt the most was the OVC, the Ohio Valley Conference. What do you expect from this league after the offseason news with the departures?
It's definitely going to be a weaker league. I mean, you're not going to see any challenge for a 2 bid. It's going to be a 1 bid league. Honestly, right now, we can sit here just based on geography, say the winner of the OVC, whoever it is going to go to one of 3 regionals. It's that kind of a league at this point. I think SEMO is a good team. I think UT Martin is a good team. I think UT Martin was tops in the coaches poll in the preseason. SEMO was second. I like SEMO personally. I think they've got that postseason experience. They were there just a few years ago down in the Oxford Regional. So I think it's one of those things where you're going to have some solid teams, but unfortunately, because of conference realignment, I do think the OVC has taken a hit. And their big additions were a couple of D2 teams, and Southern Indiana, who just won a Natty at D2 a few years ago, and then Lindenwood coming over. Lindenwood's got a really solid pitcher, Amanda Way, Weyh. For anybody listening, I want you to Google her, and I want you to look at how good her stats are because she's solid, and I think she's going to be solid even at D1. I don't think there's going to be a lot of transition for her. That's somebody who could be really good for Lindenwood. But again, when you're as the conference, when you've got 2 D2s as your big additions, you're not going to be seen super well on the national level, so they'll suffer in that sense. But they do have a couple of teams I think that could maybe fight it out. They've got a series, I believe, it's the second last week of conference play, maybe SEMO versus UT Martin for the title.
Big West. It's been Fullerton and Long Beach State that have been the top programs. Will it be the case again this year, or is there somebody there as a sleeper?
I think it'll be the case again this year. I mean, there are some teams out there. You think of even a UCSB with Joe Evans now. What are they going to do in her first year? Are they going to contend for a conference title? Probably not. Rome wasn't built in a day, and a winning softball program isn't going to be built in 6 months. But there are some teams out there in the Big West that could have some fun, that could finish in that 3rd, 4th place race. But I think it's Long Beach and Cal State Fullerton for the top spot again. Just they're the old standards. They know how to win. The talent level is always solid, which is important. And you know what? For me, I picked Fullerton. I think Fullerton's a solid team. But yeah, I think it's going to come down to a 2-horse race.
Joe Evans, UCSB. Still getting used to that.
It will be for a while.
It's going to be, but it adds some intrigue to this league. It's got some high-profile coaches in this league.
Exactly. I mean, you got Joe Evans. You even got Bob Coolin out there in Hawaii.
Still
People forget about Bob Coolin sometimes, but he's still rolling.
Rolling indeed. Big Sky. Weber State dominated the league. Got us 3 seed in Seattle last year. Are we going to see a sequel here from Weber State?
I think, the Big Sky, it's a fun little league, and Weber State should probably run away with it to a certain extent. I don't know that we're going to see another 3 seed. Weber State had a really solid non-conference last year. Had some good wins. You don't get wins like that every year. and it's not a shot on Weaver. They returned a good portion of their talent. They're pitching. I still have questions there in terms of who they brought back, who they graduated, what that's going to look like. I, I picked Weaver to win the Big Sky, but at the same time, I don't know that the 3 seed is as likely for them again.
America East.
Well, you're talking about UMBC. I mean, that's what everybody's going to say. Courtney Coppersmith's back. Kaya Matter had a really solid breakout campaign as a freshman. She and Coppersmith make for a very nice 1-2. But you've also got, for instance, a UMass Lowell, an Albany, even a Binghamton that have some solid talent on their rosters. Albany brings back Morgan Petty, Allie Lamro at Binghamton. Like there are some really solid talent across the conference. It's still UMBC's to lose. Courtney Coppersmith does not lose a lot of games. She does not pitch a lot of, she doesn't give up a lot of runs in conference. She doesn't pitch a lot of, bad games. One more year, Coppersmith's there. Matter can take up some innings for her in all likelihood. It's UMBC's to lose. I don't know that I see them losing it, but they do need to. I need to see, what does Matter look like a little more. What does she look like? Maybe where Coppersmith's not throwing every game type of thing.
The Horizon League, Oakland, Lauren Carnes, our up and rising star head coach, winning the conference. Sydney Campbell, great pitcher for them. They're the favorites. Are they still the team to beat there? Who can challenge them?
Still the team to beat as long as Sydney Campbell's in the circle. Madison Jones graduated off the offense. That's obviously going to hurt them. Still the team to beat. Do like Green Bay. Made a nice run last year. I think they've got some talent there. Robert Moore's got a couple of young players that could be fun. But Oakland's going to be the team to beat. As long as Sydney Campbell's in the circle, she's very effective and very good.
The MEAC Conference.
Howard for me is probably top of the list. They've got Kalita Dennis coming back, lead their offense. I believe she was preseason player of the year. But don't forget Morgan State's up there too. Morgan State had a really nice run last year in the regular season. Nice run in the tournament. Howard came through the tournament. But for me, Howard probably is the pick, but I wouldn't look past Morgan State either. I think it'll be one of those two.
Yeah, Tori Tyson over there in that league. And then the SWAC Conference. We don't have a Deion Sanders anymore in football in the SWAC. Not sure if we have one in the SWAC this year in softball, but your thoughts on the SWAC?
For me, I like Texas Southern. I like Prairie View A&M, even Alabama State. I think all three have some talent on the roster. I like Viviana Figueroa a lot at Prairie View. Look at Bailey Greenlee at Alabama State. I think she's a solid arm that could make an impact for them as well. For me, yeah, I picked Texas Southern, but any of those three teams could win it, and you wouldn't find me shocked.
And then finally, the Northeast Conference.
Well, I think it's St. Francis's to lose. You think about the dynasty that St. Francis has had over the years. I think it's theirs to lose, and that for me is a pretty easy pick. I did like the development of Fairleigh Dickinson. I do think Long Island's kind of always there, but for me, it's St. Francis to lose, and they've got some really incredible talent on that roster. Rachel Marston, Grace Vesco. Sure, they lost Mackenzie Saban, but I don't think they're going to miss a beat.
And the 30 final conference, 27th conference, the Ivy League.
For me, that's a tougher one. I think I like Princeton, who won it last year. But at the same time, you've got Harvard, who wins seemingly every couple of years. You've got Columbia, who was actually looking pretty good heading into 2020 before things shut down and all that kind of stuff. So I think they've got some teams that have some talent. I think they've got some teams that could play a role, could play a factor. But at the end of the day, I picked Princeton in the preseason forecast. I did pick Princeton. They lost Allie Blanchard, but they have their other co-ace, I guess you might say, back. And so for me, Princeton's the team to beat, but it's also an Ivy League that I think there are a few teams who could win that conference.
I think that's it. That's every conference, mid-major conference, lower level conference we have talked about. That is amazing. Am I right? I'm just double checking. We have hit, ladies and gentlemen, no other softball program just breaks down every conference like we just did right there. I'm just double checking right now because that's a first on the history of this In the Circle show, Justin. Go ahead, Justin. You got
Well, there's also the MAAC, the
Oh, the MAC with
MAAC,
two
if you
A's.
will.
Thank. I knew
MAC
I
with
was
two
forgetting
A's.
something. I knew I was. My count was like, wait, we're missing a conference. Why can't we have the MAC and the MAC just change? Like, come on, guys, you're all. Yeah, go ahead. I apologize, MAC. Two A's.
Well, they're just gonna they're just gonna give one of their A's back, and they're gonna match up now with the regular MAC. I mean, you talk about the MAC, the MAAC. You got Canisius, you got Marist. You've got a Manhattan team that I think had a down year last year that I think's got a chance to rebound this year. The MAAC honestly is a fun league because they do their way their schedule's set up. The fact you're talking about some low budget, a lot of Northeast teams, but there's so many fun ones. Like take St. Peter's. St. Peter's won Coach of the Year last year and finished, I believe it was third from last place. But they made that progress, they made that improvement, and so I think the MAAC actually could be a fun league. And I picked Canisius to repeat as champions, but honestly, you could give me 6 or 7 teams and say, hey, they're going to win, and I'd be like, okay. Like it's that fun of a league. It's that deep of a league.
All right, I apologize to the MAC with two A's for forgetting about you, considering maybe I'm still bitter because St. Peter's ruined my bracket in college basketball last year.
Oh yeah, I can understand that actually.
That would be
remember that,
right. Like I'm just saying. I mean, I'm a little bitter about it. That's all. Just a little bitter about it. Just a little bitter. So
I mean, just a little bitter. That's okay. A little bitter is good. Yeah.
Right. All right. Couple more things before we go. Who is the best hitter in the mid majors?
Okay, before I answer that, are we including the American?
Sure.
Then the answer is Sidney McKinney.
There you go.
I think Sidney McKinney is a world class hitter.
Best pitcher.
That one's tougher, to be honest with you. For me, I got to think about that one for a minute. I'm probably gonna say, you know what? I'm gonna go Ashley Peters at North Texas.
Woo!
I mean, well, no, I
over Jessica Mullins at Texas State.
Well, there's Jessica Mullins, and there's also Hannah James at Mercy. Can I have a 3-headed monster as the best pitcher?
Go ahead.
I mean, Peters, Mullins, James, Mullins. To be fair, Mullins is one of the best pitchers in the nation. So I think honestly, in my head, I kind of subconsciously eliminated her because I don't necessarily see her as the best mid-major. I think she's one of the best in the nation. Doesn't excuse not saying her. It's just
I forgot the MAC with 2A. So
well, forgetting the MAC with 2A's, forgetting Jessica Mullins. Okay, it's totally even. I do like Mullins though. I like Peters at North Texas, and I like Hannah James at Murray State. Hannah James at Murray State does not get the love she is due. So I'm gonna sidestep your question and give you three players who are the best pitcher in mid majors.
Best all around player. You had the first pick in the draft. Who are you taking?
Sidney McKinney. I mean, I don't mean to harp on McKinney, but I think she's that good. I mean, she led the country in batting average last year. She leads that offense that also includes Addison Barnard. She's really emerged over the last couple of years there at Wichita. She's not the big power hitter. She's not the big slugger necessarily, but she upped her power numbers last year, and she's really world class.
Great choice. I'll go Jada Cody just to be different, and I do cover her a little bit. Catcher, third base, big weapon there. Could challenge Stephanie Best for best all-around player in the history of the program offensively. If at the track that she's going, that's great. True. I mean, and Wichita State at UCF in Orlando, man. That's it's UCF leaving. It's unfortunate because this Wichita UCF rivalry has kind of been building the last couple of years in that league. So we'll see how that goes. Who is the current head coach in the mid-major that we will be talking about in May or June, like we did with Cindy Ball Malone last year, who was the extra inning softball national coach of the year? Like a Rodney DeLong, for example, who's been obviously been a lot of buzz at North Texas. Who is the next head coach you think after this year will be who?
See, that one's tougher. I could give you 3 or 4. I think Rodney DeLong. I mean, I know I'm copping out of answering the question. I fully admit this. I think you hit on one of them in Rodney DeLong, though. I think that one's easy. And I think you got to go out to the Mountain West. I think, especially if Boise State does what I expect him to do, I think Justin Schultz is probably on that list. And, if UNLV makes the run, I think Christy Fox is probably on that list. They've kind of been, inching there. But I think they have a chance at getting there. And if they make that run, I think either one of those, or honestly both of those, depending on how the Mountain West shakes out, could also fit that same bill.
The best conference in the among the non-Power 5 is who?
I'm going to stick with the Sun Belt.
Sun
I
Belt.
think I think
Okay.
I think the Sun Belt's got enough behind ULL. You got Texas State, you've got South Alabama, you've even got Marshall. I think Marshall could be something this year.
If those teams bounce back, that could be the high power. The American obviously has some pitching questions.
Mm-hmm.
Does Houston improve as they get a year before the Big 12? South Florida questions there. Conference USA maybe also could be in that conversation with,
Yeah.
especially if you're correct about Charlotte and you got
Mm-hmm.
Western Kentucky, North Texas, and even the Mount. I think this is kind of interesting. I think there's not a gap here. I think the last couple of years you could say that the American has been, certainly last year, the American by far
Yep.
clearly is getting the at-large teams to go along, in the tournament field. Could be able to gap maybe a little closer this year, and it's interesting because you got so much movement for next year, which is going to be insane on that. But for that, that's for the offseason. For now, we just got to focus on this year. And Justin, want to let the audience know on Extra Innings Softball, you're going to have bracketology. Preseason bracketology is out there. Just for shattering, I kind of followed Justin's forecast, a lot of it. So if you don't agree with some of the picks, just email him. Don't email me.
Correct.
Twitter at him. What else can they find on Extra Innings Softball here as the season now get going?
Oh, we of course, we had previews of all 32 conferences. So if anybody needs a rundown on any of the leagues you may not have paid much attention to, we've got it all sitting there, who to watch, all the names to know. We got preseason bracketology, like you say. We've got all kinds of coverage, opening week here with the team and conference and game previews and all that kind of stuff. And actually, we just put out our coaches hot list, my coaches hot list for 2023. So, some names to know in the coaching carousel. I know a lot of people like the coaching carousel when we do those episodes here and all that kind of stuff. So that's out there, just some names of people having their back of their minds, when the carousel starts spinning later in the year. That just came out as well.
Now you're traveling. You're on the road now. You're going to be heading out to Florida, and you're going to be covering a lot of softball coming up.
Yeah, I mean, I start the season 5.5 weeks on the road this year, 2 weeks in Clearwater. I got a third week in Florida. Then I go to North Carolina, South Carolina for a couple of weeks. I'll be in Nebraska and Iowa and Louisiana and Arkansas and Tennessee and all kinds of places this year.
You'll be at the NFCA. You mentioned you're going to swing by the UCF tournament, which got Boise State, Georgia in that field. I think you're swinging by Tampa, right, for Bonnie Toll's opener, Michigan, South Florida in Tampa. I know you're going to Boca later in the month, going there for that FAU tournament with trying to get there with Jordan Clark Company. You mentioned the Carolinas. You're just the mileage, my friend.
I mean, first 3 days of the season, I'm in 3 different tournaments. You say Tampa, then I go to UCF, then I go to the NFCA.
And you're going to fit in a podcast in all this. You're doing a podcast now.
We are doing a podcast from the cheap seats. We're doing weekly episodes. We're releasing on Wednesday. So, see, you can get your In the Circle on Monday.
There you go.
Go to the cheap seats on Wednesday, and you can be back in the circle on Thursday.
There you go. Throughout the season.
It's a very nice mix.
All right.
You're not going to miss anything.
You owe me about 100 appearances. I don't know. I have to ask Vic how many appearances between this and the live show, which you were on with us, the season preview. That's a lot of appearances. But hey, we always appreciate you coming on. And this was fun. We wanted to do this first time ever, a breakdown of all 32 conferences. Of course, Amanda Scarborough, we talked Power 5, you talked Power 5, we talked on the live show on our YouTube channel, and now we did the other 27 conferences. No other podcast does this except us, and Justin, you're a big part of that. Thank you so much, as always, sir, and I will see you when you come down here in Florida.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. Have fun.